Hey friends, Jeff here, and welcome back for a new episode of Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. Today we had the sincere privilege to welcome Dr. Hernan Bazan to the show. Hernan wears many, many hats in his life. He's based in New Orleans at Ochsner Health, where he is a vascular surgeon. He's a professor. He's a program director of their vascular surgery fellowship, and he is CEO and co-founder of South Rampart Pharma, where they are an early stage life science company developing novel small cell molecules for the treatment of acute and chronic pain. And as you will hear me describe throughout the conversation, Hernan provides what I call the masterclass for those that have the desire to step out of the clinical world, to step into development of innovative technologies or drug development for needs that they see in the lives and the journey of patients in which they serve. He shares with us the excitement that exists at South Rampart and in the pain space in general, and that now is the time for advancements like they are developing at South Rampart. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation with Dr. Hernan Bazan. Hernan, welcome to the show. It's really excited to have you. I loved getting connected with you and hearing and learning about your story. So excited for you to be a guest today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Jeff, and I've been looking forward to this. And you've had some really stellar interviews, and so I'm really looking forward to it as well.
Awesome. So kick us off and let us know what you're up to in the world.
Well, I'm a physician, a surgeon, and I practice. I have a full practice. Based in the city of New Orleans at Ochsner Health. I also run our vascular fellowship program, which is these are trainees that have already done both medical school and a residency, and are getting 2 years of training in vascular surgery before they go on to practice independently, and also run a biotech. Life science company on a novel non-opioid, SRP-001. As a physician, I've noticed over the years the large need for a different approach. And fortunately, we've had the opportunity to form a stellar team to execute this. So it's, the nice thing about being a physician and being a surgeon is I have that perspective that allows the ability to really shift the mindset between the clinical realm, the basic science that founded this concept. We currently have 2 NIH grants submitted under review. I've had 2 funded. And the clinical practice really does give a different perspective and a different sense of urgency. So when I bring the team together to do the execution that we are doing, I think has given us a very different approach to how perhaps things are done traditionally in life sciences. So it's a lot of it's a big process. It's obviously a tremendously long road, but we're very excited nonetheless about all the things that are happening.
So you alluded to this idea of doing things differently than traditional biotech or drug development, just given your life. You're in the operating room and you are with students. And so tell us more about what that is. So the difference than maybe the traditional approach to the development of a technology or a drug.
Right. I think frankly, a lot of companies are people that are in the business, and they're COOs, CEOs, CFOs, chief scientific officers. And you look at their track record, and they move from one place to another every few years, and that's fine. That's their trajectory, and they make a lot of good contributions, and that's one approach. Our approach has been a bit different. The 2 co-founders, we've taken these assets since we've actually, with a collaboration with a medicinal chemist, did the actual initial synthesis, and formed, like as I mentioned, truly a stellar team of individual people, clinical pharmacologists, toxicologists, CMC chemists, regulatory, bringing them in and have put in all the resources that we've raised through both NIH funding and also some dilutive funding into the development of the technology without any overhead. So obviously we pay fractionally to these individuals, but no one is employed. And in this way, we have very little overhead. Also, being a spin out from the medical school, which has a heavy presence in the neurosciences, there's a tremendous amount of equipment. LCM, SMS, truly one of the world's best mass spectrometers, very advanced molecular biology techniques, including the state-of-the-art 10x platforms for single-cell genomics, obviously tissue culture and animal labs and so on. So we've been able to do all of this in-house without having to lease or purchase equipment or have it sent out. Obviously, for the things to open the initial IND with the FDA, the initial investigation drug application, one has to go externally to CROs that are certified in these, and we did all of those things. And that's also an important point because when we did this with our regulatory consultant, we were able to pick truly the best value, the ones that would generate the best results with the best cost and timelines, truly the best value. And I'll tell you what's incredible, and I'm sure most CEOs will attest to this, there's such variability when you look at, okay, how much will it take to do a 28-day GLP tox study in two different species, for example, the beagle dog and another species, and do all of the things that are required by the FDA, and you'll get various things. So it's a lot of having the right team to execute those kinds of things, so they're done in an efficient manner, not only time-wise but cost and with high quality. And so there's not one stop for all of those things. You have to be very selective, and each one has to be done in different places to be able to get the best data in a timely way that's high quality. And so that's the approach that we've taken. So it's been a different approach by having very little overhead, putting all the research that we've raised into the development of the technology. And so been able to take it all the way from the synthesis of the initial library of compounds to one lead, to all of the molecular characterizations, the the pharmacological characterizations, all the way to opening the IND, getting into the clinic, completing the phase 1, and now being phase 2 ready in multiple pipelines within pain, including acute pain, neuropathic pain, and as well as an adjunct for migraine headaches for the FDA, receiving FDA fast track designation. So all of these things. So, there are different people that are taking different approaches. Ours has been, as I mentioned, in an academically funded, but now in a very much executing as a life science company would. And so, for example, our CFO is based in New York, Josh Blatcher. He was on the buy side of Teva Innovation for about a decade in Israel. So he understands that perspective. And now he's been a public company CFO for several years. So he has been working with us now for almost 2 years, and he's got a tremendous amount of experience that he can share with us. And in the past 12 months, we've engaged with an advisor investment bank group, Outcome Capital. It's a boutique investment bank group of about 20 plus people based in Boston. And we've been able to go to market and get specific feedback that has been very useful as we engage with potential partners that give us a lot of good feedback about what they are looking for. And obviously we listened to that, and we knew about a lot of this, and it has helped form how we execute what we are doing.
And on why pain?
Yeah.
So, I mean, as a surgeon, you've seen any number of areas that would improve the experience, the healing, the journey of the patient. So take us back into the story of, and maybe it's not one singular moment, but when you identified pain management and a different approach to that as a direction that you would go in.
Well, this really all started with the other scientific co-founder, who's actually my father, the head of neuroscience center at the medical school. So he's very well known in the neuroscience space for stroke and Alzheimer's and epilepsy, and has a tremendous amount of neuroscience expertise. And he was traveling in Europe many years ago and saw, stories about the problem with Panadol or Tylenol there, and liver toxicities and so on. And so worked with a medicinal chemist with an initial concept of how to avoid the toxicity. And what we did more recently is looked at that afresh and came up with a way of completely avoiding not only liver toxicity, but having other important features. And the reason why that's so important is because really the armamentarium is very limited. Now, obviously, this has evolved very recently as of late January, because now there's a peripherally acting sodium channel inhibitor that Vertex Pharmaceuticals has done a very good job of developing. And there are multiple other groups that are taking a similar approach of looking after other sodium channel inhibitors. These are specifically NaV 1.8 or sodium channel, voltage guided channel 1.8 inhibitors. Now, there are some positives about that, and perhaps some things where a different approach could be beneficial. For example, our work centrally in the brain through a clinically validated mechanism, and that may avoid potential issues with something that's only peripherally acting, including off-target effects and desensitization and for certain pain complexes. And then there are also some specific things about pharmacokinetics, the way it's absorbed and distributed. And that's why there are other follow-on companies. I think they're taking that approach. But without getting into those details, pain is really limited with what we have. And there's been no innovation besides what's happened now for multiple decades. And so clinically, we can give people after procedures, say specifically patients, some amount of opioids, but obviously there's abuse potential, tolerance. There are multiple, as you know, statistics are statistics. It's just when you think of individual patients, when you understand the problem, multiple instances where people have had, they're blue collar, they've had an injury, and some people have more of an abuse potential than others. And then NSAIDs, non-steroidals, are great drugs, anti-inflammatory, but they're not for everybody. And one of the issues about pain is that people will overuse it because pain is something that for you may be different than me. So even though the prescription may only be take 2 every 6 hours, you may have a lower threshold than I do. And so you may take a little more. And with chronic use, it could affect the kidneys. Non-steroidals can affect the kidneys. In the elderly, it can affect the GI lining, the gastrointestinal lining, and cause ulceration and bleeding. And then the other are acetaminophen or Tylenol in the U.S. or Panadol in world markets. And the problem there with overuse is liver toxicity. And so there really has been no other option. And as I mentioned, now the sodium inhibitors are very good because what they've done is they've brought in a lot of new eyes into the market, which for many years was dormant. Obviously, other groups like ours have been working on this for several years, understanding that because there's such a niche and such a void and such a need, that good science and good clinical evidence would carry things forward. And now that there are eyes on it, I think it's a very exciting time for developing a novel asset with novel targets like ours, and like others are taking that approach as well.
Although your father has been the central figure in this story, this evolving story, I would imagine you didn't take lightly this decision to say, I will be a CEO.
Well, we had the data. We looked at after the compounds, and we looked at we did basically the killer experiments, at the beginning, which ones work, which ones don't work, which are inconsistent. So which ones were consistently not liver toxic, and specifically primary human hepatocytes and transformed liver cells, and then carried that into animals models, 3 different animal models where they were double-blinded studies to demonstrate which ones were consistently pain-reducing, analgesic, and then looked at the molecular basis. And all of this was with a tremendous team. We first published this in September 2020, in the European Journal of Medicinal Chemistry. And that gathered a bit of attention, obviously very preclinical, um, of the library. And then fast forward through all of that, we were able to, I was the PI, co-I of two NIH grants. The NIH has been tremendously supportive, specifically NINDS, Neurological Disorders of Stroke, and NIH Small Business Office. And carried that forward, engaged with the FDA, very looked at the data, it looked at our phase one data as we got into the clinic when we completed the phase one randomized trial, and then granted fast track designation. Just I'm mentioning this just to demonstrate the translation into the clinic, and the engagement of these two very important agencies that the United States has that are really the world leaders and the world example of what excellence is. And so it's but it's a testament that it can be done, and the different approaches can be done within the life sciences to develop some technology. You don't need to hire at 400 or 500K a year a C-suite level to carry these things out. Obviously, it's easier, but with the right team and the right approach, it can be done in a meaningful way to be able to grow the technology. And of course, as I mentioned before, part of the team, besides the tox and regulatory and the chemist, is a very savvy CFO and now the advisor investment bank group that we've been working with for the past 12 months. So that has helped to translate as we moved into the clinic, the next steps, because it's important to get those perspectives and to be open-minded as to their experience.
Who are you as a CEO, as a leader or co-lead of this collective of talent and resources? Who have you become as the CEO?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the word leader. A lot of people have all kinds of definitions for leadership and so on. And I hear this all the time, especially in the clinical realm, and somewhat within life sciences. And I met a couple of years ago the CEO of a biotech in Barcelona who was visiting us in New Orleans, and he gave to what I still think is the best definition of leadership, of leading a leader. And he simply said he ran it was about $500 million a year biotech in Barcelona. They had, I think, 400 or 500 employees. And he said, leadership is relationships. So I think that to me is the best definition of it. So it's having a good relationships with all these different people, being extremely forthright, not asking them to do anything that I wouldn't do myself in terms of the level of work, and obviously listening to their perspective, yet also holding them accountable, so that the technology can move forward, and holding myself accountable and us accountable. And so there's not a lot of delegation, yet there's also not really micromanagement. It's a fine balance to keep that relationship in a very productive, professional way. Again, solely to move the technology forward. And so I think to me, leadership is relationships. That's probably the best way. So obviously that's something you have to work at daily, and you have to see and be honest to yourself, because the way I'll have a relationship with you will be different than with John Smith next, and will be different than Jane Doe, the third person. So you have to be savvy and aware of gauging that.
The wisdom that you heard from that from that, let's call him an elder who's down the road, it was extremely wise and valuable. I'm wondering, what were the seeds of that? Because what were the seeds of that were already planted and shaped for you well in advance of where you are today?
Well, I think and again, this is the different approach, and being a physician, and then training as a surgeon, and then being an actual practicing surgeon. Inherently, you have to be a leader. You always have a small team when you're in the operating room. Running a fellowship, training, these aren't just medical students or residents. These are PGY 6th and 7th postgraduate year. So these are fairly well formed. They're already general surgeons that are now getting specialized training. So they're pretty clinically savvy people that are getting more technical and clinical training. So, and again, they all come in with different experiences and different training from all over the U.S. And so you learn how to gauge how to have relationships in a different way, again, for the sake of moving forward their clinical training. And so all of these things are things that are learned and shaped from those types of experiences. From a scientific point of view, I spent a couple of years at the NIH as a Howard Hughes Fellow, and so that shaped a lot because I had an incredible mentor in immunology. And then more recently, the things that I've learned from extremely business savvy people that have been around the last several years, about how they carry and they execute things, that has been really transformative and more important for company formation in a clinical way and in a mature way.
So shifting gears into this, the name of the show, Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. What's that say to you, or what comes to mind when you hear me cast the name of the show, Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't
Perhaps it's well, I think the topic is very different now than it would have been a couple of months ago, given all the things that are happening in the United States, in the new realities. I would just keep it simple, Jeff. I would say that, similar to what we talked about earlier, that different approaches can be done to execute this. One doesn't have to be a C-suite person. I get all these emails. Oh, look at so and so. They're 20-year, COO or CEO, et cetera, and they just move around from place to place, and that's fine for some entities. But there are other models and there are other ways of doing it and executing this. And sometimes having those freshest approach are actually better because one will be much more capital efficient, much more time efficient. And I think having a practicing physician's perspective is also healthy in the life sciences. I hear so many people with a bachelor's degree talk about a patient feels this, a patient says this, but how do they really know? They don't interact with patients. They may hear perspectives, but it's a very different interaction. And again, it's a different approach. I think having a different perspective sometimes will make things more efficient. I think now being very honest and deliberate about the true value of biomedical research support to get novel technologies moving forward is important. So the NIH is critically important to this, and the NIH has really evolved over the past several years. So it's a very now business savvy entity. So there's a robust small business office, NIH small business office. They have entrepreneurs in residence. When we submit, all the PIs listening to this will know when you submit a small business grant, whether it's an SBIR or STTR, not only is there a 12-page research strategy, there's a 12-page commercialization plan that you have to submit, where you have to discuss the intellectual property, the IP landscape, your position, the market analysis, the competitive landscape, in general, obviously how your technology fits, even the pricing. And so you have to really think about these things, and they make you really elaborate on that as much as the science, as they should. But you can't leave one without the other. You have to have a strong scientific basis, unless you're sort of like a Me Too molecule, but then there's not much innovation. Now, within the life science industry, a lot of investors and partners like that because that's less risk, and they're always thinking about risk. Yet, what's going to really push the needle? Again, to benefit patients, but so their role is really critically important. And we've had an incredible amount of support from their leadership. I was very fortunate earlier in 2024 to be granted the Trailblazer Award from the NIH HEAL director, the Help Interdiction Long Term, really based on all of the team's work. And it was really a basis of recognition of all the support the NIH has done to move SRP-001 forward. And I have also found the FDA to be very dynamic in trying to, specifically to the novel non-opioid space, trying to help promote good science that's married with good clinical data. So they looked at how well characterized SRP-001 is, and then they looked at the phase 1 data, and they said, yes, we'll grant you fast track designation in acute pain. And from a regulatory point of view and a obviously development point of view, that will shorten the clinical development timeframe, hopefully by about a year and a half. And that will help to bring the technology forward to patients sooner. From a partnership point of view, obviously that's a lot less money, a lot less funding that you're in the clinic developing. So it's a lot less use of resources. You can be more capital efficient. And all of these things are, again, you have to be dynamic. And at the end of the day, it's having something that's founded well on strong scientific principles, good mechanisms with good clinical data, and then meeting hard clinical endpoints, because that's what investors and partners are looking at to move it forward and to de-risk.
As you were talking there, in response to the question, I put myself in the shoes of of another surgeon or another practicing doctor who has an idea or has a place that he's drawn to, and it felt almost like a mini masterclass you were giving that individual that about their approach. You don't have to go the normal way of a lifetime C-suite person who goes around to companies. And then you talked about the relationship with the NIH and even the FDA. It felt a mini masterclass. I'm sure there's a lot of more topics, but take us into the a conversation that maybe you've had or that you might have when you encounter another surgeon or practicing doctor around this desire or idea that they have to bring something into the world.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Jeff. Imagine weekly or every other week, I get an incoming message, an email or a text from someone at my home institution or in other places. Hey, I have this thought, this idea. How do I do this? What do you think? And obviously, it's important to be encouraging and and then so then what I'll do is I'll share resources. The overlining message that I give them though is, and I try to be very blunt with them, ideas are cheap. It's all about the execution. And you could have 20 ideas. How do you execute it? And how do you execute it again in a capital efficient way that moves it forward, moves it into the clinic in a de-risk way that is going to be palatable to strategics and investors, because that's how you can benefit patients. And so you have a responsibility. So if you raise dilutive funding from an investor or non-dilutive from the NIH and taxpayer monies, now you have a big responsibility to be extremely responsible with that. And so ideas just for having ideas is unfortunately not enough in this space that we're in the life sciences. I think ideas for asking basic science questions are extremely important, because that's how new discoveries are made. And so those are critically important to continue to support, because that's how real fundamental innovation is done. Yet to translate innovative leads also requires then to have a focus of execution. So again, I just try to, be encouraging, share certain resources that I've gathered. There are multiple things about how to protect it from an IP point of view. I'll introduce them to colleagues around the country that I've met, people that I've met at meetings and so on, and share other, resources that I have about how to present their position when they talk to certain people, individuals and groups. Those really try to stress to them, it's all about the execution. And I think that sets usually a new reality for over 90% of them. They realize, okay, well, it's a different thing that I thought it would be. And so, most people stop there, but some continue.
We're winding down to the end of our conversation. Typically I will ask a question, plant the seed of a conversation in the hearts and minds of all CEOs, but I want to drill down to this last piece around execution for these innovations, these aspiring clinicians with an idea, and you pointed them to execution. Boil that down for us, Ernan. What's the one conversation around execution that you would invite them to have, or maybe that you do invite them to have? Because
Yeah.
there's a million of them that they could have to move in that direction. But what's the one conversation, given your experience, that is the most important around execution?
I think the most important about execution is twofold. One, what we were talking about it earlier, Jeff. Anything and everything you ask of someone to do, you do yourself. And you have to be able to understand, even at some level, even if you don't have their experience or their expertise, so I don't have a finance degree or an MBA. Obviously, I've learned a lot about that, yet I comprehend some basis and I understand it. Even though I don't have a PhD in chemistry, I'm become fairly understandable, comprehensible in that space. And so, when I talk to our CMC chemist director, I can understand, et cetera, et cetera. So really understanding and comprehending so you can appreciate their thought process. And two, truly engaging with the best group of people that you can. Now, at the beginning, you don't have to have fractionally half a dozen members of your team or 8 members of your team like we have now. Though it's important to engage early with some partner of what you need. So let's say early you need, a very good, you have something you've described, you need a good IP counsel. And that's going to take time to write that and secure that and write the claims. And then you move on. And you write, and then the next thing maybe to work with a really good regulatory director that can bring in the best clin pharm toxicologists to do all the de-risking clinical pharmacological things that you'll need to open the IND. And then you need to have a really good relationship with that person to understand, okay, we're going to be the best areas to do the genotoxicity studies, the GLP tox studies, the cytochrome P450, isoenzyme studies, all those things that are needed that you could spend a lot of capital and time, and you could really spin the wheels and again, it's having those relationships and that comprehension so that you can execute it well.
I love it. Again, the word masterclass. Maybe that even becomes the title of our conversation, but it's just a real gift to those that are in those positions and have these innovative ideas. And what would you love to highlight about South Rampart, about your work, about the team before we wrap?
There's a lot, as we mentioned earlier in our conversation, a lot of unique things happening now in late February 2025 that were not happening in a year or 2 or 3 years ago in the pain space. And we knew this was coming. I was on the panel in New York 2 years ago when the bio report came out, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization by Dave Thomas, a very timely report at the time about the need for more eyes in the pain space. Obviously, Vertex was working on their asset. We were working on ours. Others have started coming on with other sodium channels or perhaps other approaches. And so now it has opened and there are a lot of eyes. We didn't talk about how the market looked at the Vertex approval in a very positive way in terms of how their market cap changed. And also how their market cap changed when they had disappointing phase 2 results in December for chronic pain, which is also very positive because it shows that there's a large market. And so all of these things, I think, are putting a lot of eyes, investors' eyes, and a lot of strategics' eyes, again, into the pain space, as it should, because it's such a large clinical need. And the important thing is to understand that they're going to be rewarded when novel assets with very good clinical data that are founded on strong science are moving forward. And so all of this, I think, is a very exciting and unique time now that I think will be occurring for the next foreseeable future.
And where can we send folks that want to know more?
Well, they can look at our website, obviously, southrrampartpharma.com, and they can look at our LinkedIn page. And, there are multiple news stories that are coming out. There was a very good piece this morning in the biospace on this discussion, on Vertex, on us, and on other approaches. And there are other things that are actually timely coming out that have come out in the past week and will be coming in the next couple of weeks. So look forward to a lot of activity.
Awesome. Well, we'll put as much as we can that's current in the show notes when we release it, and encourage folks to connect with you, or stay tuned with what is happening at South Rampart. Hernan, this has been a real joy. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation.
Well, I really enjoyed it, Jeff, and thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed talking with you, and congrats on these thought-provoking shows that you do. And I look forward to listening to more of them.
Awesome.